Good morning. The Committee of the Whole is called back to order. We are in Chapter 1 in the amendment section, but we will continue recess until we have a quorum. Thank you. committee of the whole is called back to order. We do have a quorum. The only thing, we're gonna have to continue the recess, and the only reason why I'm gonna say that is because OFB has to look at the amendment that was submitted by one of our colleagues and do the numbers adjustment per amendment. And then as soon as they're done, then we're gonna ask the question on the colleague's amendment. Okay, so we will continue recess while OFB is working the numbers, because the amendment I'm referring to is Senator Parkinson's amendment to adjust the BBT. And when you adjust the BBT, you adjust the pharmaceutical rainy day fund. There's a lot of numbers that have to be adjusted. And until we know where we're at, and then also advise everyone that if you have an amendment that does not relate to Chapter 1 revenue projection, I will rule it out of order. And several of my colleagues have already withdrawn their amendments. So it's dwindling down. And I'm hoping that we complete Chapter 1 today, and we will start Chapter 2 on Monday. We'll allow everybody a chance to go over their DOE and UOG and everybody else's chapter to make the appropriate amendments. Because once we start the chapter, no amendments will be accepted. All right? Thank you. We will continue recess while OFB is putting together the numbers on the amendments that have already been proposed. Yes, Senator Tello?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the numbers that they're putting together, are they going to let us know what those are? Okay,
yes.
So is Senator Parkinson expected to come in? Is he excused?
No, he forgot something at home. He should be here any minute now.
Okay.
But while they're doing the numbers, it allows him that leeway.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. We're back at recess while OFB puts the numbers together. Thank you. The committee of the whole is called back to order. We are now on the amendment introduced by Senator Parkinson. It's under file name SB 26 WAP L27 P2 COTW. It's amendment on line 27, page 2, to amend the bill to read business and privilege tax from 350,796,922 to 357,232 and 123,000. And I'd ask the author to speak. Reminder, colleagues, if you authoring an amendment, you have 10 minutes. Everybody else got 5, and then you have time also to close your amendment. Okay, and then I'll have OFB speak in reference to the numbers that you brought up, what the impact is. Senator Parkinson.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. The reason I introduced this amendment is this body and this OFB in particular has had a history of having surplus funds at the end of every term, which is a fantastic credit to them. However, there is an unintended consequence of it, and that's sometimes when we have a pool that's too big at the end of the term, things get really hasty and we start rushing legislation to try and spend that money as fast as possible. And so in anticipation that we are continuing this trend of conservative budgets, I would like to propose that we increase the projections from the BPT from -1% to 1%. And that would account for the difference in the raise in projections. This is money that could go towards public safety, towards education, towards the things that are important today, so that we're not fighting over it tomorrow in a disorderly way. We have a budget season for a reason. When we have little pockets of money like this that we know are coming down the line, all it does is it turns its back to the legislatures of old, where we are fighting to get ad hoc budgets through, frankly, just to score political points and get our own little pet projects through. So to that spirit, let's raise the revenue projections a little bit now so that we can use those funds and get them budgeted properly this season. Don't want to make this a long thing, so with that, Mr. Chair, I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. I'd ask OFB to speak in reference to your amendment so that he can provide the numbers to the colleagues. Steve?
Good morning, Senator. Thank you. On your proposed amendment, Senator Parkinson, the intent, I believe, and I'm going to clarify it, that the current proposed level for the business privilege tax in the budget bill is $350,796,922. You are proposing to amend that to a level of $357,232,123 for a variance of $6,435,201. Is that my understanding?
That is correct, sir.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and just take your 357 million amount and kind of divide that by 12 and give us an average monthly collection based on that amount. That amount will yield about $29,769,343. Taking that amount and comparing it to the revenue estimates, that both revenue estimates and tracking of both BBMR and OFB, it is higher. In the case of BBMR, the amount is about 1.1 million more per month, and for OFB, it's 536,000 plus per month. So in essence, we are going to raise, your proposal is to raise the BBT by about 6.4 million, which is not tracking by either Bureau Budget or OFB, and that, whenever you whenever you come up with projection, one of the most important things is that you use tracking. That's a solid way of determining at least a comfortable number. But you also have to give room, wiggle room, in the event we don't hit that target, that amount. And that is why we normally take the average, or we normally take the average growth. Anything above that, you're risking the chance of not meeting those projections. So in the past, and I've been somewhat conservative, and for the last 4 years, like you asked me, I have never once ever overprojected. And yes, over the last couple of years, it's amazing how this government is collecting revenues beyond its projected levels, and that's great. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't over appropriate. And I agree with you that when you get large amounts of surplus, and I use surplus, not excess, surplus money, because surplus is, normally we use the term surplus when we refer to the audit report. And that is the finite number and the true number of how much the government is actually surplusing every year. The excess, when we use the term excess, it's excess monies that the government realizes every month as it collects its revenues, and it's reported in what we call the CRE report. So that being said, for me, I'm just a little bit uncomfortable, although I may not disagree with you totally, because I think everybody in this room is hoping that we do exceed our numbers that what we project for the year. But just to be on the safe side, and like I said, you never know what could happen. A natural disaster can come, another repeat of COVID, and this is overnight. These are things that are not going to take months to happen, which will have an impact on the economy. And it's better to have that room, that wiggle room, to make adjustments as we go forward. And that's, that's my response to you. There is nothing to prohibit this body from increasing it. I'm just saying, if we want to rush the gamut of doing that, and that's up to the body to decide. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate your perspective.
All right, thank you. Does any of my colleagues would like to speak to the amendment? You have 5 minutes. Senator Dueñas.
Mr. Chairman. I certainly rise in objection to the amendment. Steve, I want to go back once again and say, when I first asked you about this budget proposal, and really kind of a sea change in our very, very, I think, appropriate conservative budgets that have generated these surpluses, I said, well, you've put these numbers forward, and unless we're going to reduce or adjust, we'll live with it and we'll deal with what we got in the chapters. But going up, I'm sorry, I cannot support that whatsoever. It's kind of interesting to listen to my colleague, and with all due respect, I think that this body over the last several years has demonstrated that the very prudent measure of being conservative and then appropriating those funds, by and large, I think the people can understand that we have done that responsibly. We've returned their taxpayer money for credits and gas. We've returned their taxpayer money to try to help with their power bills. We've given money to the Department of Education that was used for pay raises in prior federal funds. We made that whole. By and large, I gotta say, I'm very, very proud of a lot of things we've done. We've put money, millions of dollars, into the LEAP program to try to shore up our businesses. And the good thing about it, Mr. Chairman, and to OFB is, these are all revenue generators. These are things that help generate the revenue that gets us to where we are. But I will be remiss if I do not also mention this. I get it on economic activity. I get it on the fact that obviously there's a lot of money moving in this town. But we're also at 5%. Now, I know there's no appetite other than some of us who have been very, very vocal about this. But at this 5% BPT and at the accumulation of these revenues, I think the people of Guam say, if it's not going to go down to 4%, at least invest that money in the priorities. And what I have a hard time with, and this is what we're getting away, I like to avoid, is the runaway train again. Appropriate everything you got. Party today. That's where the discipline gets lost. A lot of us who have been talking about prior years, a lot of us who have been in a situation where the economy wasn't what it is, and we didn't have all this federal largesse, and we didn't have $60 million return on EITC and the ACTC and all the and the 5% BPT, struggling to pass budgets to balance to help. We finally say now we have money now for things other than salaries and benefits. We can give these agencies the tools that they need to do what they do. Department of Education, the hospital, police cars, more cops. We can finally do things that are not just getting by and hoping money will come in for operations because we got to cover 92, 93% salaries and benefits. That's all our money goes to from our taxpayers. And that's why I like what we're doing in terms of being as conservative as we can be, so that we truly do show our mettle when we appropriate those excesses, not burying it into a budget that can be manipulated. So for that reason, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I humbly object, and I thank you for making the presentation, OFB.
Thank you. Does any other colleague would like to speak to the amendment? There being, Madam Speaker?
If I could ask the sponsor of the amendment to yield where he gets this 7 million additional projection.
Senator Parker, do you yield to the question?
Yes, I happily yield to it. It's based on the tracking. If you look at the budget that Steve had put through, there is it changes the BPT from a negative 1% revenue projection to a 1% revenue projection. And his testimony that changed yesterday was that changing from a negative 1% to a 1% revenue projection would still be considered very conservative. And that's where that difference comes from, is if you change the revenue projection from negative 1% to 1%, and that's in line with all the other taxes that he projected on the CRER. Every other major tax category in the general fund, he increased by 1%. Corporate tax he increased. Withholding increased. So for me, it didn't make sense to decrease the BPT when corporate taxes and withholding taxes are also going up. So this adjustment just puts them in line with all those other major tax categories.
Thank you. Question for OFB. Yeah, is this, so your bill right now, the bill that we're looking at, projects 18 million over FY23. Is that a 1% or negative 1%? Increase?
Just to clarify, Speaker, and Senator Parkinson, when you refer to the negative 1%, are you referring to the negative 1% in terms of what we are calculating to collect every month?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if you look at the analysis, what we did is, and we do it across the board, because it's a certain categories that you need to consider also about the growth. We are actually, I think, estimating actually about
But annualized, it's minus 1% over CRER tracking, correct?
And it's only the difference because what we did is, although we came out with a tracking amount, we took a little bit conservative amount. It's not a reduction of 1%. It's how we look and view at the actual item of revenues that we're dealing with.
I understand that, sir. I'm just asking you to look at it from a different angle.
Yeah, and we have, and I appreciate the fact that you're taking it verbatim of what we came out as the average. But in all fairness, also that we also increased the BBT over last year. So that increase itself is saying that although it shows a negative in terms of the monthly recording, but the actual average increase over the revenue fund itself is an increase over FY23.
So, Mr. Guerrero,
Yes, ma'am.
Director, the 18 million over FY23, that's accurate? That's what we're projecting, right? Or that's not, that's what our bill says. That's the variance. And what percentage is that?
Yes, Senator, the 18 million is what we're tracking over the recommended amount.
No,
the amended amount.
That's the difference in the FY23 and appropriation and this appropriation in this bill.
It's the difference between the amended appropriation and what we're tracking.
Okay, well, I was reading this from your spreadsheet.
Yes.
It's the OFB proposal versus amended FY23 budget. The variance is 18 million PPT. And so I just wanted to point that out, that we were already going 18 million above the FY23 amended budget amount. That's 18 million above for BPT, and we're going 29 million above the governor's request.
That is correct, Senator.
So in other words, we are predicting 29 million more than the governor had predicted back in February.
Yes, ma'am.
Based on increased tracking.
And that is where I'm saying, you know, although I've always been known to be conservative, I am actually going out on a limb on this one simply because of prior year.
Yes, you guys actually have gone way over, like $100 million. Our budget will exceed FY23 by what was the amount? $121 million or 200?
99 right now.
$99 million. That's for me huge. And I'm normally very much with Senator Parkinson that if we are going to get the money, I want to appropriate it. I want to control that. I do not want to do what we did in previous years. In the very beginning where I came in, we left hundreds of millions of dollars unappropriated, and it seems to me that they were able to use it however they wanted. So I definitely agree with the legislature controlling how that money's spent. It looks to me, from what we heard over the past few days, that it's reasonable to predict that we will be receiving more based on tracking. It's kind of mind-blowing, actually, that we've increased our budget by 200 million through a pandemic and through a typhoon. But hopefully everything continues to go well. And why do you think we should not predict 7 million more? We're already predicting 350 million.
Senator, it's not a matter of me wanting to, excuse me, increase it by 1 million, 7 million, 10 million, 15 million more. I think it's just what we've determined based on all the information that we have. The numbers that we have is somewhat reasonable. People will say, well, you know, 7 million out of a $1.1 billion budget is really nothing. I said, well, it is, because, you know, if you keep adding all the increases, at the end of the day, it's going to be 30 million. And we're going to use the same logic. Why don't we increase this another million? Why don't we increase that more? I don't have a problem with it. But, you know, I feel that the numbers that we're presenting in the bill are numbers that are very much real, and I think they're achievable. I think there's something that we can count on to come in. there could be a variance, absolutely. It showed there was a variance in the last couple of years. But I, for one, I'm not too comfortable going beyond. And like you said, $99 million is a lot for 1 year. I don't think we've ever seen that in the last 20 years, with the exception of last year. We've never grown the budget by that much. But last year is an exceptional year. And we still don't know why. Is it attributed to all the military activity? Is it attributed to, all this federal assistance? Nobody knows. But we can make the assumption that all of these things will come to an end someday. The big question is when. But we're gambling that at least at the rate we're going, the collections we're doing, is that at least for the next year, it'll be positive. Positive enough to substantiate what we're proposing in the bill. Any increase in that? I mean, we can do it, but I just feel comfortable with the proposal, that's all.
Thank you. Mr. Guerrero, when do you think we should relook at the budget and the revenue that we're actually receiving and adjust expenditures? I know if it's negative, our revenues are below, then there's a provision in statute for a supplemental budget, right? Or a revised, I forgot what the term is, but a revised budget pretty much to adjust to those lessened revenues. But in the last few years, it's been an increase in revenues or an excess in revenues. When do you think is the safe time to relook at that and appropriate those monies?
Like Senator Dueñas just mentioned, I believe the legislature have had the opportunity, at least over the last 2 years, to appropriate items that, as we go along, everyday operation, the government of Guam, to each fiscal year, you're able to address, you're able to fund with monies that are actually cash. They're real monies. If we appropriate to what we estimate, or even say at the optimal level of what we think we're going to generate, and it doesn't materialize, then we're going to have a bigger problem of how to address all these appropriations and not have the funding for it. I agree with Senator Parkinson. It's kind of crazy to surplus $100 million and keep it there for a whole 12 months and then appropriate it later, or appropriate during the course of the year, which to me, I feel better because you have it in the bank, versus trying to anticipate having this money appropriated today, come 6 months down the road, we're short. There's no way you can take it back. This legislature is not here to de-appropriate, because in my honest personal view, every appropriation this body makes, I think was well justified, and there was a purpose and a need for it. For the legislature to come back any time and try to de-appropriate an appropriation, I think I failed. I honestly do. Because it's my job to make sure this legislature is well equipped to have the financial backing to support all appropriations made by the body. And that's why I have this conservative approach when I do the budget.
Thank you. The only thing I don't agree with the sponsor of the amendment on is that appropriating later means we're doing something wrong. We're doing pet projects, political points, and all of that. I actually agree with OFB that it's very responsible, that if there is extra money, it's either the legislature is going to dictate how that's used, or it's going to be used however they want. So I think that's a very responsible thing to do. There's nothing wrong with making sure you've got the money in the bank before you use it. However, I do see his point that $7 million above the projections in our bill today are consistent with FY2023 actuals. The problem is the OFB's telling us those actuals, we don't know yet if that's an anomaly. They can't tell us what that's based on, and if that will continue during FY24. That's one of the things that I had asked about. And pretty much everybody was just optimistic. Some cite increased tourism, some cite, what was it, just optimism. But, so I'm not really sure myself, of course. But thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Does any other colleague like to, Madam Speaker, are you done? Okay, does any other colleague like to speak on this amendment? None, then I'll ask Senator Parkinson to close on his amendment. You've got 5 minutes to close. Thank you, Senator Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what we're asking for here isn't crazy. We're asking for an extra $7 million on a $99 million projection. It is changing a negative 1% revenue projection to a 1% revenue projection in line with all the other major tax categories. I'd like to thank Steve for his consistent conservative budgets that have led to multiple years of surpluses. That is a credit to you, sir, and you should be proud. That being said, it has led to unintended consequences here in this body. I think that if we have the money, it should be budgeted in the budget season. Because this body can get very chaotic when there's a whole bunch of money floating around. What are we going to do this spring, one of these springs, when we find ourselves with $120 million in surplus? We're going to rush to spend it. We're going to go do good things with taxpayer dollars, and we're going to have some people object that we should wait till budget season. And then there's going to be a bunch of crying in baseball because we're using procedural rules that we didn't agree to. And it all becomes very, very messy. So let's just stop. Let's all be adults. Let's do it here in the budget season. I'm not saying you're not an adult. I'm just saying this body has some work to do. But that being said, thank you again, Steve, and I hope my colleagues will support this so that we can, have our Hunger Games for this $7 million now rather than in the spring or in any other time when we're having to do it as fast as we can in rushed manners. Let's do it now in the budget season, deliberately, so we can look at everything holistically. Again, this is just a budget projection revenue adjustment from negative 1% to 1%. I know $7 million may sound like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, I think even that is very conservative. I think we have further to go. I think even with this 1% and this $7 million change, we are still going to see surpluses, and we are still going to have the Hunger Games this next spring. So I hope my colleagues will support me for this 1% increase so we could have a little bit more to appropriate now for public safety and education. And when the surpluses show up again down the road, because I know Steve is the man, good luck, and may the odds be ever in your favor. With that, I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Senator Parkinson. We will now move on the vote. There is an objection. All in favor of the amendment introduced by Senator Parkinson to raise the BBT from 357.96.922 to 357.232.123. Please raise your hand. All in favor, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. Motion fails. We will now move to the next amendment. Senator Parkinson, your next amendment is to amend the bill to read other taxes from $6,701,360 to $10,435,239. Senator Parkinson, your next amendment? Another on, okay. OB asked, they needed time, at least what, 15, 20 minutes? Just a 10-minute recess, they just needed, what happens is...
It's okay, Mr. Chair, I withdraw my other amendments.
Okay, you withdraw it, okay. Thank you. Are there any objections to withdrawal? Thank you. Withdrawal is done. Now we'll move to the Senator Paris. I think you are next, ma'am. My colleagues, her amendments that she has here, some may say it's not in order, but it is in order. And the only reason why it's in order because we did it in the previous budget. It's notwithstanding. It's written, and I'll have Senator Sabina, you got 10 minutes. Your first one is, as a matter of fact, I'll just read your amendment, then you can speak on it, okay?
Sure, thank you.
The amendment is to add a new section of Chapter 1 of the bill to read. The section is through technical, from the legal, they'll make the correction, they'll identify this section. Notwithstanding any other provisions of law, funds received in excess of the adopted revenue levels enumerated in section 2(1)B, section 30 of this chapter in the amount of $500,000 shall be appropriated to the Department of Public Health and Social Service, Division of Public Health, Bureau of Non-Communicable Disease, and $100,000 the Guam Behavioral and Wellness Peace Prevention Training Brand for the purpose of tobacco, nicotine compliance prevention and education.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yes, the source of funding for these appropriations is basically for any Section 30 funds that are above the adopted levels currently in this proposed bill. And so I believe the adopted levels are at 75 million. So this is, yeah, 75 million. And considering that, you know, there was money since 2017 that was withheld by the U.S. Department of Treasury for the war claims. And so that has been accumulating over the years up until the end of last year. And so we heard in the Committee of the Whole that only 35 million claims are actually adjudicated. And so there is a source of funding potentially that can come down, whether it's this year or 3 years from now. So that's was also testified in the Committee of the Whole that to reconcile what is due to Guam could take up to 3 years. And so in the case that that money does come through, I would like to reserve a very small portion of that to a very important cause. And so it's been documented by the State Epidemiological Operating Work Group, also known as SO, that Guam has the highest usage amongst youth of nicotine. And currently, we have the notoriety of being the #1 consumers amongst youth of vaping products, nicotine vaping products in the world. And so I believe that this is underfunded with the current budget that we have. And should we get this money, it's essential that we address this epidemiological problem. So just to give you a little bit of some of the statistics, you know, initially smoking was in decline, but because of vaping, so vaping is in the rise. And we hear this from administrators, we hear this from teachers and parents, that there is a high rise in vaping amongst our youth. So basically in 2019, Guam Department of Education did a yearly study that reported that 40% of high school students had access to smoking tobacco, and 1 in 8 are current smokers. Additionally, 1 in 4 middle school students had tried smoking, and 1 in 10 are current smokers. Some anecdotal evidence also is that we're seeing in elementary students, as young as elementary students, and these are highly addictive substances and something that they are going to be having to deal with for probably the rest of their lives. And when we're dealing with, you know, addiction in youth, it's very much different for addiction in adults. I mean, addiction, of course, is not a good thing. But when we're dealing with youth, you know, the brains are still developing. You know, they're still developing up until maybe early 20s. And so the impacts of addiction in youth is much larger. And not only that, you know, tobacco-related diseases are a major cause of death on Guam, major cause of, you know, the cost of healthcare here. And so tobacco control policies are closely associated with reductions in the prevalence of smoking. The other thing is that in 2019, the yearly study that was done, it was stated that 68.6% of high school students and 49% of middle school students in Guam have used the electronic nicotine delivery device. 1 in 3 or 35% of high school students and 1 in 3 of middle school students are current users of vaping products. So from 2015 to present, electronic nicotine delivery device use among Guam's public youth is on the rise, which points to the need for additional funding to the public and grassroots approaches to nicotine control and prevention. And many of us grew up at a time when there was a lot of initiatives, right? We were faced with a lot of initiatives to, stop drug use, and that we don't see very often these days. It seems very quiet and silent, and so, part of the reason, perhaps could be the prioritization in policies today, as well as the funding. And so what this amendment does is, for the 500,000, so is directed towards the Department of Public Health. So right now, the programs that they have there are directed towards adults. So there's something called the quit line. So the quit line is only accessible to adults, not to youth. And so what this 500,000 would do, it would expand it to the population that is in need, and definitely there's a gap. It'll address the gap currently with the 500,000 for the Department of Public Health. And they're also involved in cessation programs, other cessation programs. So as a teacher, I recall that there were, students that were addicted. They would go through this program. So yeah, there currently is a program, but because the need is greater, I think it's important to expand these services. The 100,000 to the Guam Behavioral Health, the Peace Prevention Training Branch. So currently there's only 2 employees assigned to, compliance and education amongst vendors and consumers for the whole of Guam. And so what this 100,000 would do would add additional employee. And so what we're getting out of this is more enforcement and compliance amongst those that are selling, so to ensure that they're not selling to our youth, and then also education. So how can we prevent the use amongst youth? And so I think these are dollars well spent. Should that Section 30 money come, which there has unspent funds. And so I ask for my colleagues' support. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paris. Does any of my colleague like to speak to the amendment introduced by Senator Paris? Yeah, Senator Blas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, while I recognize the reason presented as to why the appropriation should be considered, I object to the amendment in notwithstanding the use of the notwithstanding provision, in that, for lack of a better term, the germaneness of the chapter is to discuss the revenues that we anticipate. And that for us to be able to look into, put a crystal ball provision into this chapter, I would rather that, first off, if you look at it and where it's at and where it is intended to be placed, one can argue that we should bifurcate the amendment, but more importantly, and just as important, is first off, where and how does this affect already what the Section 30 provisions are? I'm asking that as an open question, not to be answered. Don't worry about it. This argument or this amendment is better placed in the appropriate chapters, first off addressing the particular department's budget, or maybe in further back in miscellaneous provision. We opened the door to this one in this type of amendment. Why don't we just put notwithstanding, put all the other chapters into chapter 1? Chapter 1 is specifically to talk about the revenues. I wouldn't be making this argument if this amendment was placed up in the appropriate chapters that are appropriate for this kind of amendment. So I object based on protecting the integrity of what the purpose is of the chapter 1 is of this budget bill. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minority Leader Senator Blas. There has been an objection. Is there anyone else who would like to speak on the amendment? Okay, Senator Brown, and then Senator Parkinson, and then Senator Fisher, and then Senator Chris Barnett.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I certainly appreciate the purpose, the desired objective of this $500,000 funding, but I also, as my good colleague from Barrigada here, I have to object to the placement in this particular section because I concur. I mean, otherwise we should take every appropriation and put it in Chapter 1. And then again, this continued idea, you know, we talk about this so-called conservative budget and, you know, we don't want to go beyond that and we're just, you know, really being responsible. And yet at the same time, I would like to ask maybe our OFB office, do we have any evidence so far? I mean, I'm not going to argue this money may be owed, but do we have any evidence that this money will be provided in this fiscal year that we're looking at trying to address this $500,000 appropriation? If I can ask that question, Madam Chair.
The author of the legislation?
No, I want to ask OFB, do we have any
okay, so we'll have OFB.
idea if this money is actually something we're going to get this upcoming fiscal year to address this requested appropriation?
Okay, Steve, can you answer that, please?
Yes, Senator. You know, I just wanted to clarify. The proposed bill is basically identifying, and the way it reads is any excess funds adopted revenues enumerated in Section 2(1)B, Section 30, which is specifically the Section 30 funds, shall be appropriated to the various appropriations here in the bill. Again, in FY23, in the budget bill, we indicated that we anticipated to collect around $75 million. Unfortunately, we only collected, the actual amount was $70 million that came in. We are anticipating FY24, at least another, we'll bring it up to $75 million because historically that was our tracking, with the exception of FY23. So again, we hope to get at least the $75 million. But the way I read the bill is that we're talking about anything in excess of the $75 million is going to be appropriated. And that, again, you know, whether or not we're going to get the $75 million is one thing. Is it reasonable to assume that we can get it? Yes, we've gotten it in the past. But whether or not we can get it in FY24, that is what we're hoping to get. So if it does come about that we get more than the $75 million, then of course maybe the bill would be reasonable. But at this point, I will just comment on that right now.
Thank you. I appreciate the response. Again, you know, we've been down this road. We went down this road last year, and we have all this, you know, excess revenue and all this other things that we've thrown in to address appropriations. And there's nothing from stopping this legislature any day of the week from coming into session. I prefer to see the money that's there. You know, to borrow the phrase from that movie, right? Show me the money. I'd rather know that it's there and appropriate it because I think that's a responsible thing to do, than to continue to appropriate, notwithstanding with the expectation that if there's excess here, excess there, then maybe we'll get to fund this. In addition, when we continue to appropriate from what is unaudited funds, you know, we're in a situation right now where we're still awaiting the public auditor's report, so that we actually know at the end of the day what money has, you know, what we've appropriated is actually the money's been there, or the money's there. But we've also appropriated an awful lot of things where we were doing it with excess revenue that at the time were not audited and we didn't even know if the money was there. And now we're waiting to find out, which is late. That report is late, of course. I know the public auditors apologized for that situation, but it makes it difficult, you know, to tell the public we're being responsible, we're being conservative when we're appropriating from money, even though we're looking at asking for another $100 million to appropriate this particular year, which to me are leaps and bounds of unprecedented expenditures or desire to expend money in the government that we've never had. Most of the years, fiscal years, we've actually you know, appropriated beyond what's actually been available. And the heyday, the party, as I said, will end. You know, at some point at night, as my colleague earlier told me, you know, we're going to run out of beer in the cooler and it's going to be time to go home. So while, again, I have no objection whatsoever to the intended use, and certainly our good senator that sponsored this amendment has articulated very well the need for it and the programs that this will provide for. Certainly anything that's, you know, doesn't support smoking, I'm for it, because I've seen and experienced in my own life some of the challenges, not myself, but immediate family that have suffered from this and collective other health issues as a result of smoking. So I'm certainly not an advocate of smoking. And otherwise, if this had been a real direct appropriation from existing funds that have been identified, would certainly wholeheartedly support it. But under the circumstances that I've outlined already, I cannot support this proposal, nor will I have a comfort level in supporting other forms of amendments that continue to rely on funds that we don't even have in our hands right now to legitimately appropriate. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to comment on this amendment.
Thank you so much, Senator Brown. Next is Senator Parkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too have to echo the objections of some of my comments. This is Chapter 1. We're discussing revenues. So, you know, if we're going to put expenditures, let's put all the expenditures in Chapter 1. This is not the appropriate time or place for this amendment, and because of that, I'm going to have to object as well. With that, I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Senator Parkinson. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to associate myself with the comments of Senators Blas and Brown. I agree with what they're saying, and I also agree very much with the intent of this bill. Anything that can be done to crush vaping, I am totally on board with. I'm sorry? Oh, it's an obvious evil that we need to get rid of. But I was talking with another colleague who shall remain nameless, but she's smarter than me, and she pointed out that in this bill, because we're appropriating money that hasn't arrived yet, we might be tying the hands of the 38th, 39th, and 40th legislature when they come in, because we're appropriating money that is in their pocket, not ours. And so, you know, Senator from Chalampago, you know, she observed. Joanne, are you from Chalampago? What? For 40 years. Anyway, so I'll wrap it up. I really support this bill. Let's crush vaping, but I just don't think, I think this is constitutionally perhaps infirm. I don't see how we can bind the 49th Guam Legislature. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Barnett, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the amendment, and I commend the author for this forward thinking. As the Chair of Education, I've had a lot of conversations with not just GDOE leadership, but teachers and staff about the prevalence of this plague of vaping that is affecting our youth. And I know that GDOE has told me that vaping represents the #1 disciplinary infraction across the district. They also told me that they have seized so many of these vaping devices that they don't know how to get rid of them. Because as you may well know or may not, but I for sure know the author of this amendment knows damn well that these vaping devices are, they contain hazardous substances that Guam EPA has to get involved in just disposing of this. So yeah, this is a major, it's got to be one of the top issues affecting our youth. So of course I commend the author. And honestly, I don't think the people of Guam care where the hell we put this amendment, but I just want to show my support for the good senator from Barragata Heights. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Barnett, for being such a good colleague. Okay, there's been an objection on the floor. All those in favor of the subpoena?
Excuse me, Madam
Oh,
Chair.
sorry, I'm closing. I am so sorry. My apologies, Senator Paris. Please, you may close.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So I appreciate the comments of my colleagues, and you know, I hear that there might be issues of the form or the location of this, but you know, I think that, you know, considering the impact it has on our community, you know, I wanted to make sure that, you know, funding was made available to them. But I guess at this point, I would like to withdraw the amendment, but, you know, place it in a different chapter, and I look forward to their support. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paris. Okay, we have another amendment on the floor. Moving. Oh. So there's been a motion to withdraw the amendment, the Senator Paris amendment, on line 8, page 10. Are there any objections? Seeing no objections, motion carries. The next one we have is again for Senator Paris on another page 10, line 8. Senator Paris, you have the floor.
Yeah, no amendments at this time to proffer this.
So you would like to withdraw?
I'm not going to proffer any
Okay,
at this point.
okay, so we're going to go through all of them.
Yeah,
Okay, there's no more amendments that
No
you
more,
have?
yeah, thank
Okay, so that being said, anybody else have any amendments? For Chapter 1, looking at the clerk, is there any other amendments for Chapter 1? Okay, there are no more amendments for Chapter 1, so we are now closing Chapter 1. Oh, Senator, Speaker Tolan.
I don't have an amendment, but this is round 3, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask OFB one more time if they have any way to track the 20 million that the governor keeps saying she took from education, when really it was never deposited. Well, what I can gather is it was never deposited to education. It was never moved to education. But they're taking it from the general fund because we authorized her to take money from the general fund for the typhoon expenditures. And they have $34 million in excess funds in the general fund, but they decided to announce that they are taking 20 million from the Guam Department of Education. Is there any way to track that? Is that in their AS400 as an accounting transaction, or is that just an announcement? And
Yes, Senator. I believe the way the law was written, it gave the authority for the governor to identify the 20 million within the general fund. As you said, there's nothing in the system right now that indicates a specific fund for this specific project and purpose. So therefore, twofold. One, I don't know what the funding source is of the 20 million. And two, and if there is, I don't have, we OFB cannot identify where that 20 million is.
all right, I thought it was, I was surprised that, yes, with all the excess revenues that we have in general funds, and that all the agencies are required to use their existing appropriations for typhoon expenditures, which I'm thinking are above and beyond their normal operations, and the money they decide to dedicate to the typhoon funds are from the food relief money that we had appropriated years ago. They finally found it and now have put it up to the typhoon instead of for food. They took some money from, it says, FEMA COVID reimbursement for.
Point of inquiry, Madam Chair. Are we testifying again?
Pardon?
Excuse me? No, Senator Parkinson, Senator Speaker has the floor right now. So you're asking for a point of information?
Point of inquiry. Yeah. Are
Inquiry?
we test? Like, do we have time again? Like, how long did you get to
This
speak
is
here?
the third round, Senator Parkinson. Everybody has the opportunity in the third round, whether they have an amendment or not.
Yes.
So if you don't mind,
Please
go ahead.
don't interrupt.
Speaker Tulay, continue, please.
Yes, so of course I was talking about the money that was taken. There's the last part of it, very small part, was from FEMA reimbursements for COVID quarantine facilities, very small amount. Have we received any other revenue from FEMA reimbursements for COVID?
Senator, if the government has received anything, OEB it's not purview to that. Like I said, the difficult thing about this, like you mentioned earlier, departments and agencies are required to use their own appropriation to fork out the money up front to cover whatever FEMA-related expenses are or the emergency, and then with the hopes that they will be reimbursed. You know, my only concern about the reimbursement part, and it's not overnight. It takes a while to get the reimbursement. So if they are using operational funds, and it puts them kind of in a pickle because they can only use that money up to the end of the fiscal year. If the reimbursement doesn't come in to reimburse what they spent, then I don't know how they're spending their appropriation level as made by the legislature.
Right, and they might only be reimbursed 90%, so they're still 10% short from their normal operations.
That's correct.
Even if they're able to use it in the fiscal year, right? I am also concerned about that and confused about that for these smaller agencies who are not able to juggle funds like that. The other thing I wanted to ask you is the FY22 audit is not complete yet. On the September CRER, it showed their accounting for FY22 balance. And do you have any other additional information that would show what the potential excess revenues for FY22 might be?
No, Senator. The only official document that we use to determine the government's finance at any particular time is the CR report. So, given that's the document that we all use to figure out the financial condition of the government, no, I can't. There's no other information that I have other than that.
All right, and then the liquid fuel tax reduction that we passed again recently, is that accounted for in your revenue projections?
Yes,
and for how long?
Yes, it is. The liquid fuel tax was supposed to be for 6 months. The first 3 months is in fiscal year 23, and we did consider the remaining 3 months in FY24.
And that's all. And so after that, you're predicting the liquid fuels tax revenues
back up to normal, yes.
Okay. All right. Are you aware of appropriations from 23 that were not used that we could use in 24? For example, I remember in 22 there was an appropriation for the maternity ward. They never used that in 22. I saw it in the audit somewhere, or 21, or 2019, 2021, throughout that. But are you aware of any of those off the bat for 2023 that we appropriated that they were not able to use?
Senator, if you look in the financial system, there's going to be quite a few appropriations that were made throughout the years that have not been expended or fully expended. those balances become available at the end of the fiscal year or whatever period the project was stated for. If there are appropriations within the system right now that have not been expended, those appropriations normally will die at the end of the fiscal year, and we do not recognize those appropriations after the fiscal year or any designated period that the project was set out for. To date, there are numerous appropriations in the system that you will see that have not then been expended. So also in the department's appropriations. There's, like I said, the administration holds 50%, 5%, 10% of department's appropriations every year as a safeguard to ensure that the government collects revenues sufficient enough to cover the expenses it expends every month. So at the end of the year, if the agencies are not allowed to spend their 5, 10, or 15%, or whatever the reserve amount is, that money is actually held in abeyance and can consider to be lapses, unspent appropriations. So to your question, is there any balances or any appropriations out there that have not been expended? There are some in the system. Whether or not they're available to be reappropriated, now that's something else.
Well, if we deappropriate it from that use that they're not able to do, then it should be available unless we
Absolutely. That's correct. If the body decides to go ahead and deappropriate these appropriations, those monies will technically be available. Whether or not the cash is there to support those appropriations, that is something else.
All right, and then the Healthy Futures Fund is determined by law how that's supposed to be spent. Does our budget conform to that?
Yes, it does, Senator.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome, Madam Speaker. Senator Barnett, do you have any comments or, okay. Senator Snagastine, any comments or concerns? We're going to go down the line. Senator Duenas, any comments? Okay. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for that. Minority Leader Senator Blas, any comments or questions? None? Okay. Senator Brown, any comments or questions? None? Senator Fisher? Okay, I think, and Senator Brown, Paris has already spoken. We are going to, with no objections, we're going to move on to Chapter 2 on Monday. So first I'm going to close Chapter 1. Any objections? None? Okay, Chapter 1 is closed. Now we're going to go to Chapter 2, but we'll do that at 9 a.m. on Monday. So 9 a.m. on Monday, we're to return, and we will begin with Chapter 2. I keep saying 12, Chapter 2. My colleagues, please note that all the amendments for Chapter 2, as we begin that, must be in. Before we speak on Chapter 2, all your amendments must be in before we begin, otherwise the chair will rule it out of order. So please do so, maybe today or first thing Monday morning, put your amendments in for Chapter 2 so we can run for a smoother one.
I'm just going to object for the record on that. I'm just going to state it at least, Madam Chair, because I think this is a deliberative process, and if in the course of our deliberations we decide to make an amendment, to have that outright objected and have everything pre-prescribed before we come on the floor really is not the historical way of how this legislature is run. So I have to say I might do it on my own here, but I'm objecting to that procedure.
Okay, there's been an objection to the chair's ruling of having all amendments. This is my, I'm only a vice chair, okay, so I'm following the chairs.
Well, Madam Chair, we'll just if necessary, we could always make a motion to override the chair's decision.
Yes.
At the appropriate time. I'm just saying it. This pre-prescribed session that we come to the public and where, everything has to be done in advance. If you have an idea because of a deliberation, you're prohibited from representing that. To me, it's just highly inappropriate. And it's not part of our deliberative process. At least it should not be. And historically, it was not the procedure.
Okay. Senator Blas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to agree with the previous speaker in that, unfortunately, as it has been presented and prescribed as to how the amendment process is going to take place, it then also may spill into you know, the discussion of making amendments to amendments. And if we're going to hold that kind of like, rule in totality, it then precludes us from being able to do that, which is, I think, very disingenuous, as well as, you know, it may help an amendment either pass or fail. Okay, so I have to agree with her with the objection of that. I recognize that we will, in order to be able to move things along, that if there are already amendments that are thought of, that you know, you put it in post haste, but at the same time to restrict that no more amendments as the discussions go on. There may be, as a result of the discussions, a need for an amendment, and I don't want that to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Blas, Minority Leader. That does make sense, and I will allow Senator Augustine to make a comment as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I kind of agree with everyone, but number one, that was the rules read earlier. And let's just follow it, and if there's an amendment to the amendment, not a problem. Then you don't need to amend it, because it's an amendment to an amendment. But at the same token, you can always bookmark the chapter and come back to it, and it starts the clock again. So, you know, there's really no holding back. I think you've got a whole weekend to think about any amendments you want to consider. But then it'll be ruled on the day it happens. Then we'll move on from there. We're here to work as one team. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Augustine. Senator Barnett, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to also echo that we are here to work as one team, and I would also like to use this time to wish the people of Guam a good weekend, and to please drive safely. Dai Challenge, Apalaxi to the Maxi. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Barnett. Wishing you a very happy and prosperous, constructive weekend as well, to you as well as my colleagues. That being said, I'm going to revise what I mentioned earlier with regards to amendments. So I'm going to revise that to allow amendments coming in, especially amendments to the amendments, as long as we're on Chapter 2 and we're discussing Chapter 2. And again, like our good chairman mentioned earlier, that we can always bookmark and come back to that chapter if you have something. So I'm just asking my colleagues then, putting it this way instead of mandatory, putting it this way for your consideration, that we run a smooth budget and try and finish as soon as we can, because we know we have an obligation to pass this budget this month. So I will revise that, Senator Brown, and take it into consideration, and we'll follow that recommendation that you made. So I'll pull that back, okay? Okay, so that being said, before I close, I'd like you to all turn around and look up the viewing on the second floor and wave hello to our DYA students who are here visiting the legislature, and saying hello to them. Wishing you, Viva, Viva. Okay. Thank you, colleagues. That being said, we will recess until 9 a.m. Monday morning and starting on Chapter 2. See you, and have a safe and prosperous weekend. Thank you.